Welcome to the New Economy Forum. I'm Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. This afternoon, we will dive into the outlook for the impact of AI on the global economy. That music you just heard was actually AI generated. AI holds the potential to boost productivity, improve consumer welfare, and bring vast benefits to the global economy and society. But AI could also fortify big tech's dominance, displace workers, widen inequality, and increase misinformation. Here to talk about what policymakers and technology firms can both do domestically and globally are Ira Dablanouris, Deputy Director in the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, Christine Chung, Director of Digital Development at the World Bank, Mike Pisa, who specializes in global economic policy for Google, and Crystal Rujeje, Managing Director of the Center of the Fourth Industrial Revolution for Rwanda. Welcome to all four of you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ira, let me kick off the conversation with you. How do you see AI reshaping the global economy? How do you see it impacting advanced economies versus emerging markets? Do advanced economies have a leg up?
So thank you so much, Jennifer. AI could potentially have really a profound impact on the global economy. And some have even argued that it could be at the scale of the Industrial Revolution. So it could revolutionize business operations, public sector operations. There's a growing body of research which shows that it holds the potential for new revenue, cost savings, improved products and processes, augmenting worker capabilities, and some studies even find that it could raise labor productivity by 2 to 3 percentage points, and a few others argue that as much as 7 percentage points. So these numbers, what do they mean in the aggregate? Still hard to ascertain, but the potential gains could be very large. And the potential gains could be large for all countries. It could raise livelihoods, it could raise incomes across all countries. Now, that said, the impact will depend upon how it's adopted across countries, and it will depend upon the extent of integration across countries. And here, advanced economies could potentially have a leg up because it may be easier for them to adopt AI.
Christine, to Ira's point, how transformative do you think AI will be? We hear from big tech CEOs, AI experts, this is the new secular trend for the economy. Certainly sounds like it with what Ira said. How do you see it? Will it boost productivity?
Maybe I can start by looking at the speed of the impact of AI. If we look at digital technologies in our history, it takes a certain period of time when you reach 100 million users. If I look at fixed telephony, it took 75 years. When it comes to mobile, it was 16 years. Apple Store, probably 2 years. ChatGPT, you probably know, it took only 2 months to reach 100 million users. For us, this is transformative in a way. It really sets the new stage for connectivity and also a new stage for economic systems. So that's one. The second thing I want to mention is that we did a stock taking of all the World Bank projects that received funding from us in 7 different sectors. And our initial assessment is that for all the 7 sectors, including health, education, agriculture, transport, etc., we are seeing initial positive impact from AI adoption. Again, AI is not a new thing. Generative AI is, but we have been applying AI already in our operations. For me, the sectoral applications, the productivity gain and the potential for countries to leapfrog is huge.
Crystal, when it comes to emerging markets, what are the challenges in terms of adoption for AI? Do they have the necessary digital infrastructure, basics like electricity, access to internet? Do they have to invest in that backbone first before they can begin investing in AI? Or could they invest in both simultaneously, lest they be left behind?
Thanks, Jennifer. I think, as Christine has already alluded to, we've seen the impact of, technologies like mobile, telephony and how it's been able to help Africa really makes significant gains, it doesn't mean that there aren't gaps. And part of the gaps that exist, both in coverage gaps and usage gaps, it's that hard infrastructure that requires really massive investment. So what are we talking about? We're talking about, the connectivity. We need to expand, high-speed internet access to, the majority of the continent. Right now, we're only scratching the surface. It's only, really covering about 40% of the population. We need access to reliable and affordable electricity. We need access to robust data sets, and also the cost of data, for people to access that data, as well as the cost of devices. And so there's really, significant gaps in that infrastructure, but, and I think this is the right forum, for people to kind of double down on their investments, and also, be creative in terms of the kind of capital that we can attract, not just relying on governments to do that. So we've certainly seen, the private sector play a big role in telecommunications, but we can really take it a step further to really, cover that gap, particularly with those that are, truly underserved in the rural areas. But I think one area, if we move away from infrastructure and we just talk about, we're in this kind of inflection point in the evolution of AI. And Africa already has a young, dynamic, innovation ecosystem that is really ready to kind of harness the opportunities. And so as we're prioritizing that investment in the hard infrastructure, we need to find a way to level the playing field for the innovation ecosystem. So, just to give one specific example, coming from Rwanda, we've been working with a startup that has been training a large language model in our local language, Kinyarwanda. And we've already seen them improve the accuracy, starting from the model not understanding the language at all to about 70% accuracy. And they want to deploy this to the 75,000 community health workers. But for them to be able to do that, just for if one health worker were to do one inquiry per day, we're talking about $6,000. So that's the kind of level of, kind of computing costs that we're talking about. And so you can imagine it's really quite a barrier to entry for the startup ecosystem. So I think as we're looking at the hard infrastructure, let's try to empower those developers that are already there so they can fully, take advantage of this moment.
Mike, Crystal just talked to some of the challenges there, but Google believes that AI could be a game changer for emerging markets. Is that right? You think it could help pull them out of poverty, help narrow that gap when it comes to access to education, healthcare, food insecurity?
I think, and thanks for having me, and thank you to the bank and the fund for having me. I really think it's going to be a fun discussion. We would not say that AI is going to be a silver bullet for any of those problems you just mentioned, right? I think it's a tool like any technology, but it's also a little bit more than just a tool. It's going to be in that rarefied company of general purpose technologies, which you can arguably count on one hand, like steam engine, combustion engine, electricity, ICT, that share three characteristics. One is broad applicability. And already, as someone has mentioned, we see AI everywhere already, right? And we see it in search, we see it in autocorrect, in maps, and in translation devices. But its use is going to become much more pervasive over time. The second characteristic is capacity to improve, and I think we're seeing that on a weekly basis. Just the performance of these models continue to outstrip one another. And then the third is leading to innovation spillovers, right? And I think we're also seeing a lot of complementary investment and a lot of complementary innovation around AI models. When it comes to development, I think the IMF staff discussion note from January, maybe, when it came out, it was a great report, and it had a very sensible baseline, which was that emerging markets would lag in the diffusion of this technology, and they would also probably have a muted impact compared to higher income countries. And I think, again, sensible baseline, but there's also a credible case that can be made that emerging markets can exceed those expectations for a couple of reasons. One is what Crystal mentioned. I mean, we're talking about young, digitally savvy populations. AI will be the first major technology that's rolled out in a world in which there are more internet and mobile phone users in low middle income countries than there are in high income countries. And there's also inherent characteristics of the underlying technology that kind of lend themselves to accessibility. The first of those is that you can engage with these tools through ordinary language. The second, which is related, is that these tools are increasingly multimodal, right? So inputs can be in the form not only of code or text, they can be in the form of voice or image, and that breaks down barriers. So when you combine that ease of use with these underlying population characteristics, I think it's easy to get excited about what could happen. And we see that reflected in optimism. Google has funded some surveys with Ipsos globally, and actually it's emerging markets. Those that are surveyed in emerging markets tend to be much more optimistic about the technology's impact than those in higher income countries.
And so what do you think are the most promising economic applications when it comes to economic development for AI?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to know where to start, and I would frame this. We have a paper we published earlier this month, which I think I'll flag. It's called the AI Sprinters Report, and it's really a humble attempt to draw on lessons we've learned for being an AI company since 2016, to help policymakers think about what's needed as prerequisites, but what are the use cases that they can kind of focus on. I would put the use cases in two buckets from a kind of a development and government perspective. The first is kind of just efficiency gains, right? These tools can help you do better data analysis, improve your decision making, you can automate routine tasks, you can set up chatbots so that civilians can have easier access to information. And then the second bucket of tools is related. It's about efficiency gains, but it's really about expanding the reach of government services. And here, when I think about it, why do we see uneven distribution of public goods? Generally, it's a constraint either in funding, in human expertise, or information, right? And AI can help, emphasis on help, address all these problems. I'll just give two quick examples. So one, we're working with an organization in Kenya called Jacaranda Health, that we're distributing AI-enabled handheld devices to do ultrasounds. So you don't need to be connected to a large ultrasound machine. You also need much less training to use these devices. So that's just an example of how you can really spread access to maternal health in remote, poor areas. And another is a tool we've developed called Flood Hub, which takes machine learning, matches it with geospatial imagery and satellite imagery, and is able to make predictions about when a river is likely to flood 7 days in advance. Using more traditional techniques, the early warning signs were only available 2 days in advance. So this gives you a sense of how governments can better target their resources.
Ira, Mike talking to potential efficiencies for governments. I'm sure we have some global policymakers here in the audience. Is there any way that AI can create efficiencies for governments when it comes to the fiscal side? In other words, creating the potential for lower spending, better tax collection, perhaps lower deficits?
No, Mike, very nicely put it. AI has the potential to make public sector operations and public sector delivery much more efficient and much more effective across the board. Just to give you some concrete examples, so fiscal operations, procurement, revenue collection, they could all benefit from enhanced fraud detection and from automated audit processes. Mike mentioned health, but think about education. You could have chatbots that could allow students to learn, particularly in areas where teachers are scarce. We already see that giving children access to digital tools improves their test scores. And so it could play a really important role in education delivery, for instance. In terms of tax collection, it could help widen data that is collected, could help widen tax bases. So overall, it could play an important role in not only improving the efficiency of spending, but allowing it to reach more people, public sector delivery to reach more people, and enhancing tax collection. And as such, could potentially lead to lower deficits and improved public finances.
We'll have to see about that. Mike, back to you. Curious, how can, on the flip side, Google assist governments with the technology?
Well, I think when I think of how AI companies are working with governments, one of the things we've been very focused on, and I think this goes back to Crystal's point, is improving access to digital infrastructure and also improving digital skilling. So let me just talk briefly about the digital infrastructure challenge. I think I outlined all the ways in which AI has these inherent features that can make it more accessible. But that means nothing if people are not connected to the internet. So to Crystal's point, if 1/3 of the world is not connected, that means 1/3 of the world is not going to benefit directly from AI. So I think we need to kind of double down our efforts to continue addressing that challenge. It's something that we've helped address through massive investments in subsea cables. I think so there's digital infrastructure. I think another thing we need to do with digital infrastructure is kind of broaden our definition, right? It is not just about connectivity. It is also about access to data centers. It is also about access to cloud computing services. And it's also, I think to a point you made earlier, it's about access to good data, which means modernizing national statistical systems and making sure they're well funded. And the same holds for digital skilling, which is an area we've worked a lot with governments on. In that AI Sprinters report I mentioned, we probably have a too cute idea, but I think it's somewhat useful of like breaking down how we think about the needs in this space. We have 3 sets of segments of the population. First is AI learners, who we think like virtually everyone in society should have some form of data literacy, digital literacy, and AI literacy. And then we have AI implementers, which are the smaller segment of the population that's going to need to learn how to use these tools at work and modify them for their specific needs. And then you have AI innovators, who are going to be those folks with the kind of the cutting edge knowledge needed to really kind of like tailor this technology to address local challenges. And you're going to need different modalities of training for each level. And yeah, so this is the challenges section. These are big challenges. But that's how not just Google, but I think all the private sector can work with government to kind of help provide. And let me just say also, since we're here at the World Bank and IMF, that this is, I think, a huge role for the MDBs and a huge role for regional institutions to be pooling resources, financial resources, human capital resources, to help lower-income countries kind of meet these challenges.
But let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the impact of AI on the workforce. Ira, the IMF came out with a new report in January. It said that almost 40% of global employment is exposed to AI. When you look at advanced economies, it's even higher at 60%. And that's owed to the fact that jobs in advanced economies tend to be more cognitive oriented. And so in a twist, do you think that perhaps jobs in advanced economies are more at risk for displacement, or could AI serve as a complementary tool? I mean, we heard the music that played that was generated by AI, not exactly Grammy winning, but perhaps could be a tool for songwriters and music producers to write music.
So what's interesting is that historically, what we've seen is that automation, digital technologies have tended to affect routine tasks. Right? And one of the things that sets AI apart from sort of pre-AI generation technologies is that high-skilled workers could be more impacted. Right? So these are workers doing cognitive tasks, as you said. And as a result, advanced economies clearly have greater exposure or risks from AI, but at the same time look to benefit more because they have more high-skilled, more educated workers. So in the report that you mentioned, the staff discussion note that was released earlier this year, found that 60% of the workforce in advanced economies is more exposed to AI. Now, about half of these workers are complementary, if you will, to AI, and so productivity would be enhanced as a result of AI and Gen AI. But for the other half of the workforce, they could, however, face greater threat of displacement in the labor market. And what this would mean is that this would have a negative impact on labor demand for these types of workers. It could push down their wages. And if you could think about sort of an extreme case, some of these jobs could just disappear. Right? So you have this range of positive and negative benefits. Now, turn to emerging market in low-income countries. Here, you see much lower exposures. Right? You see something like 40% in emerging market economies and 26% in low-income countries. So you could walk away from this saying, well, this means that these countries are going to be less exposed to the disruptive impacts of AI. But then as the panel has just argued, these are precisely the countries that could also be left behind. And for all the reasons that have already been mentioned, lack of skill, lack of appropriate infrastructure, and what have you. So the danger here is that the technology could not only widen cleavages or inequality within countries, but also across societies.
I want to come back to that point in a moment, but Christine, Is there a way to shelter some of the displacement that could occur from AI? Is there a way to stop some of that from happening?
Maybe I can start by saying that it's really hard to predict, right? Whether it's jobs augmentation or whether it's jobs displacement. When we were looking at statistics, we found that about 60% of the jobs, according to the title in 2020, didn't exist like 60 years ago. So that means actually it could create a lot of new jobs. I still remember in the mid-90s, I was working in a genome database at Johns Hopkins University. So I was entering data. And now, one of the growing industry is actually image labeling, right? So the market is probably 1 to 3 billion. So that means that maybe my previous job was replaced, but it's probably even more interesting and better paid jobs these days. So it's hard to predict in the sense also, as Ira mentioned earlier, right? Whether it's more skilled or less skilled. Another example is that actually maybe some surgeons' work now is replaceable, while the nurses who actually hold patients' hands and try to be comfort, right, to patients, maybe those jobs actually are more valuable. So the only thing we really know is that we really don't know where AI, in terms of augmenting or replacing or displacing, is going. What the government can do to really help, of course, is reskilling programs, social protection programs, but also taxation and redistribution, so that people who actually don't manage to reskill, don't manage to find new jobs, will still be protected.
Ira, what are the implications here when it comes to different genders in terms of the impact of AI on the labor market? I have here in my notes that the IMF believes women's jobs could actually be impacted more than men's. Why? And what does that mean for the gender pay gap?
So that's an interesting question. So I'm going to go back a little and to some of my previous work that sort of predates AI. This is more, we're still thinking about digitalization, automation, and so forth. And we found that women, on average, face an 11% risk of losing their jobs due to automation, compared to 9% of their male counterparts. And this is because women tended to be occupied in sectors or doing tasks that were more amenable to automation, and such as clerical positions or in retail sales and what have you. And our analysis showed that these differences in the routineness, if you will, of job tasks could exacerbate gender wage gaps. So for example, even after taking into account factors such as differences in skill, occupations, experience, the choice of occupation, nearly 5% of the wage gap between men and women could be explained purely by how routine women's tasks are. Okay, so this is pre-AI. Now, fast forward, and we're talking about AI and Gen AI. The same research that I had mentioned, the IMF's staff discussion note earlier this year, finds that on the one hand, women are more exposed to the threat of AI. At the same time, they're also complementary. They're in sectors or doing tasks that are complementary to AI. So, there's both risks and opportunities. My own forthcoming research is a less sanguine on this account. And we find that actually women could potentially lose more. So this highlights that, it's really important at this juncture for governments to start thinking about policies that could foster greater gender equality and empowerment, particularly in this sort of potentially changing landscape of work.
Yeah, certainly, absent AI, we still need that. Crystal, let me come to you. You talked about Africa's burgeoning youth population. What does Africa need to do when it comes to training the workforce for future jobs so that they can fully participate in an AI global economy?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So I think, just recognizing that Africa has a critical role to play in the global economy. The fastest growing workforce in the world, one of the fastest growing consumer markets. By 2030, I think about 42% of the global population will be African. and so just first recognizing that role that they have to play, and for the world to appreciate the opportunity that lies ahead for making that workforce the most productive. And so Michael actually touched on many of these points around what we need to do to upskill, but I think just recognizing that particularly in the space of AI, there's this broad spectrum of career paths that young people could take part in. And so really thinking about it from the perspective, of course, we need to invest in those deep research skills, because we don't just want to be consumers of the technology, we want to be producers of the technology. And only when we're producers of technology can we create solutions that are fit for our context, that embody our values, and are really kind of grounded in our needs and opportunities. And we've seen examples of investments, for instance, in Rwanda. It's been about 13 years now, but they attracted Carnegie Mellon University to come and set up a campus in Rwanda and open it up to the whole continent. So they have about 25 different nationalities that are there, and there are many other examples actually of these kind of Pan-African talent pools, but specifically in building high quality engineering talent, data scientists, computer scientists, and really kind of that high quality technical expertise that we would need. But on the other side, we've seen young entrepreneurs that don't necessarily need to have the technical skills, but we know that AI could really just supercharge their productivity. And so we're in a moment where when we see this workforce, although the numbers are daunting if we don't pay attention to it and make sure that we're giving them the right skills and opportunities. But I think that for me, I'm very optimistic about the workforce. I think that Africa's wealth is in its people and its young population, and so I think it's upon us to really make sure that we give them all the different entry points to be able to access the AI value chain.
Mike, what's Google's view on how AI could impact the labor market?
Google's a big organization, a big company. So I don't know if we have one single view. I will give you my view, which is, let me channel David Otter to give you a view I agree with, okay? And I'm going to channel a specific paper some of you may have seen where he wrote about what could AI be a boon to the middle class. And I think we're focusing a lot about automating tasks, and that makes a lot of sense because that's where the pain points are going to be, that's where the disruption is going to be, that's where people are going to feel it. But Otter makes a point that most innovations actually don't necessarily automate tasks, they create new capabilities. The very straightforward example, which is easy to visualize, is airplanes didn't automate flight. Airplanes allowed us to fly, right? And so, and similar to the point that Christine was making, it is almost impossible to imagine the new jobs that are going to be created from these technologies because we don't really know yet how these technologies are going to evolve. Before electricity, there was virtually zero demand for electricians, only the ones that were involved in creating electricity. And the same before computers, there was virtually zero demand for programmers, right? So it is much easier to calculate exposure to AI than it is to predict what new jobs will be created. And the other point I would make, again, this is not a Google view, I think this is my view. This is one of the stylized facts that has come out of early research about AI and productivity is that if you look across the domains that have been studied, so writing, coding, customer service, you generally find most people benefit in some way in terms of the quality of their product and how quickly they can produce it. But what you find is that those with less skills or less experience, more novice workers, benefit significantly more, right? So it has this leveling up impact. And if those results kind of scale across domains, scale across industry, which is an open question, but if they do, you could see kind of a reversal of the income polarization that we've seen over the last 50 years that is tied quite tightly to educational differentials, right? And a lot of that is tied to, is partially attributed to the role of computerization and digitalization. So this could really turn the tide.
To Mike's point, do you think that AI could widen the gap when it comes to income inequality, either within countries or between countries?
I think, again, I like to go back to history. So if we look at technologies, especially disruptive or general purpose technologies, usually the advancement actually widen the divide. I think panelists already mentioned, right, the access to infrastructure, including data infrastructure, but also within the country, between the countries, obviously, but also within the country, between the urban area and rural area, gender disparity, we see there's a big risk of widening these divides. And I think, when we look at the reasons, right, why AI adoption or digital technology adoption is lacking in many of our low-income countries, is that we see one reason is, I think panelists already mentioned, right, device affordability. If you don't even have an interface, right, with AI, so nothing can happen. The other is the digital skills, right? You need to have at least basic skills, to look at that. Our hope, of course, is that when technologies advance, hopefully the entry level will be lower, right? The devices will be cheaper. The technology apps will be more easy to use. And with translation, hopefully language differences will also be bridged. But the divide overall, the potential of widening is really huge. That's actually our number one concern for the World Bank, is how to bridge this divide on so many different fronts.
Ira, to you, what is the IMF's view? How do you see AI reshaping inequality in general?
So let me make sort of 2 points here. I think it goes without saying that we need policies to harness the benefits of AI for all, but there's 2 components to this. The first is that there is a component of regulation, and when it comes to rules and regulations, this could be a brave new world that we're in. And it will require, an entirely different approach to regulatory policy and public policy in general than what we've seen before. I think it would be fair that I think a lot of people would agree with that. That said, countries are adopting many different approaches, from very, very laissez-faire to no approach whatsoever to some other kind of approaches. And I think, the IMF is of the view that we need robust regulatory frameworks. We need data privacy. We need, data security. These are all essential to ensure an inclusive and ethical transition to an AI-driven economy. So that's my first point. My second point is that sort of beyond regulating AI systems, the broader effects on economies will have to be considered. And the panel here has talked about a lot of issues in terms of reducing inequality and making access, making infrastructure and skills available. There is a lot of uncertainty in terms of the potential scenarios, how bad this could be for labor markets, how quickly will it be adopted, over what time frames, and so forth. But given the potential threat of widespread job losses, I think social protection systems will have to become more nimble. So, governments will have to move away from this business as usual kind of scenarios to really think about what could be the potential scenarios that could impact society. So social protection systems will need to be made more nimble. Education systems, we've talked a lot about how it could benefit education delivery, but what about education systems themselves? How will they have to change in order to be made more fit for purpose? When it comes to inequality, we have to also talk about tax systems. I think there's one sort of fundamental issue is that do tax systems in some countries disproportionately favor labor-saving technologies or automation? Is there sort of this bias, if you will, that's embedded in tax systems? And what about tax systems creating a sort of a winner-takes-all dynamics, which in the case of these kind of general-purpose technologies could be huge. We've seen this with the railroads. We've seen this in the past. So it could happen. And so are tax systems fit for purpose in this new world? And these are some of the issues that are going to be covered in a forthcoming staff discussion note that we will be releasing. The IMF will be releasing, my co-authors and I will be releasing later this month. But I finally want to end with competition and regulatory policy, because we also need to ensure that we don't end up with these supersized, with all due respect, supersized companies, with huge amounts of data, Mike, with these supersized companies with huge amounts of data and computing power that have an unfair advantage. So we need to guard against that as well.
Mike, do you care to respond to Ira's point on competition? Google definitely a leader in AI.
Yeah, I think I set myself up by saying Google's a big company. I might have spilled the beans.
I think we already knew that.
Yeah. I think we see AI as a space where there's going to be a lot of competition. And I think the success of ChatGPT, somewhat to our dismay, like when we say AI and we talk about large language models, ChatGPT is what we're generally in our mind is the first instance, right? So, and I also think with open models, there'll be a lot of competition, and there's going to be an entire supply chain underneath the largest language models that there's just going to be a lot of value that can be derived by a lot of different actors. But I think it goes directly to the points we're talking about is that, and Crystal mentioned this, like countries need to have the capacity, people need to have the capacity to be able to use these large language models and tailor them. They need to have the expertise, they need to have the access to high quality data. So that they can use that data to kind of like develop local solutions to local problems. But I think if we find paths to do that, then the competition aspect will kind of take care of itself.
Before we move on to talk more about regulation, which you already broached a little bit, Ira, Crystal, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on the inequality debate. And coming from the position of Africa, what needs to be done to create equal access to this technology?
I think we've touched on most of the points, So I think there's the infrastructure piece, connectivity, electricity, data, devices. Those are all areas that we need to focus on. I think that maybe one opportunity to really close that gap is this aspect of data, if I can just maybe give it some nuance. Most of the large language models that are out there are in kind of commonly spoken business languages. Let me call them business languages. And I gave an example of one of the models that we're trying to train in Rwanda, but the richness of Africa's kind of the linguistic diversity, we're talking about 3,000 dialects, 1,400 distinct languages. And so if we can imagine that we're giving young people access to digital public infrastructure, that are trained with these different languages and not just written text, but also voice text, because we know that for many communities, it's, they're part of the oral tradition. They may not be fully literate. And so, just being able to give them access. And so I think that there's a tremendous opportunity in the data space. And so one of the ways to close the gap, countries need to think about really a very robust data strategy and how they're approaching it to close that gap, because there's tremendous amount of content that they can harness, even if you talk about like the ecosystem just within the mobile space that they can harness. We touched on the need to protect that data once it's out there. One of the first things that Rwanda did, even in its journey to set itself up to take advantage of this age of AI, was put in place a data protection legislation to make sure that people's rights are protected, under the law, but also trying to create an enabling environment and making sure that businesses have a clear understanding of what are the rules of the game, when you're trying to access people's data. And so we still have, there are a number of countries that have put these legislations in place, but we're still lagging behind. And I think certainly on the policy space for AI, I think that, Rwanda has a policy in place, but it's still mostly focused on the innovation and being able to harness the opportunities. And really trying to ground the governance piece in use cases and not be too rigid to kind of suffocate the innovation ecosystem. And then lastly, I think partnerships is one of the areas where we can really close this inequality gap. There's no one single actor that will be able to do this, one government alone, or even the World Bank and IMF. And so I think there are opportunities to really create different types of partnerships to be able to address this equality gap. And one thing, maybe if I can just take the opportunity to talk about briefly, Africa as a continent, I think there's an opportunity for them to really harness their convening power to engage with the rest of the world when it comes to how they're approaching AI. And so the center that I'm leading will be convening the first high-level summit on AI in Africa. And it's really, many of the global summits that have been happening, Africa has really been a footnote to many of these conversations. And so it's really to bring together thought leaders, heads of state, ministers, business leaders on the continent, but also those that want to partner with Africa to really have a focused conversation about what it will take to really, move the dial and unlock opportunities for our workforce. And so I think partnerships is really one area that we have to just think creatively about, and opening it up to all the people in the room to figure this out and work together. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about risks and regulations, which we kind of started to dip into. Christine, Japan's largest telecommunications company and the country's largest newspaper sort of rang the alarm bells last week when they reportedly called for speedy legislation to rein in AI, saying democracy and social order could collapse if AI is left unchecked. Is that a risk not just in Japan, but in general when it comes to this technology?
Great question. And maybe I can start with the list of potential risks, because we talked a lot about benefits already in the panel. So we covered a bit about job automation. And then we talked about whether it's widening divide. But other risks, we also talk about big tech company market dominance. But there are other concerns like privacy, algorithmic biases, cybersecurity challenges. Misinformation for me is one of the biggest challenges, and copyrights. And not to forget, in addition to ethical concerns, but there are now also environmental concerns. Because AI and data centers, the energy demand is so huge, right? So it's a long list. It's a long list of risks. And last year, we actually conducted, again, a stock taking of all the various regulatory approaches in the world. So we looked at the first movers, EU, America, China, and Japan. So if you look at the models, basically it's a combination of hard law, soft law, and also self-regulation, and alongside of technology-specific regulation, but also there are responsible use approach. So it's kind of a matrix of different approaches. So at the end of the day, of course, we are still in a wait and see mode to see whether this actually works for our developing countries. And my view is also there could be, for various reasons, diverging regulatory practices. And this is concerning because if we don't address that, then there's not only regulatory arbitrage, but that also creates a lot of trade barriers, disruption in supply chain, and just in general distrust, right? Distrust among people, companies, and countries. And then ultimately, if users have distrust in a system, then the adoption will be much slower. So I think all of that kind of calls for collaboration. And there are, international initiatives that we are seeing that are looking at principles. And ultimately, it's not about principles. I was chairing a panel in Barcelona at the Mobile World Congress. Actually, most countries actually agree on the basic principles, including values and ethical uses. The problem is really when it comes down to practice. When we talk to our clients, I was in a parliamentary member forum on Monday. So there are legislative representatives from many countries, including low-income countries. Their questions really is about how do you balance multiple public objectives in practice when the principles are clear, but the regulation actually is multi-sectoral, right? And it's competition policy, it's consumer protection, it's data privacy, it's cybersecurity, and the goals can range from national security to societal impact to economic efficiency. And all of that is just really difficult black box for many of our clients. We actually don't have the answer how to solve it, but we are trying to develop a little bit a decision tree to say if this is your objective. Because some countries, or some of our World Bank staff, we're still in a learning mode to see what is the difference between data sovereignty and data privacy, data ownership, how do we classify data? So it's a little bit a collective learning for all of us, especially on the regulatory side.
Mike, what is Google's responsibility? What is big tech's responsibility when it comes to this technology and the impact on society? Christine brought up misinformation. We know that these machines tend to hallucinate and fabricate, make up information, pass it off as truth. That may get passed on in terms of recommendations. So what is Google's obligation to society?
Yeah, so let me answer in two parts. First, I'll take on the hallucination question, then kind of what is big tech's responsibility. I think the really interesting thing about, one of the really interesting things about generative AI is, unlike all the traditional software we are accustomed to use, it is not deterministic, it is probabilistic. So I think there's a misconception out there that if we only train these models on factually accurate data, that it would come back with factually accurate responses. But no, because of how this technology is created, how it functions, it will be generating new content that may not be accurate, right? It will be probabilistic. And I think what this means,
If you feed it good data, it won't necessarily spit out
it'll
good data.
improve the reliability and accuracy of results, but it will not eliminate what we tend to call hallucinations, right? But where I think we are seeing like improvements very quickly is in the space of grounding these LLMs on external data sources that we can kind of consider sources of truth, right? And so you might see this acronym, it's coming up much more frequently, RAG, Retrieve Augmented Generation, right? So the idea is that, the LLMs will create their, creatively create the content that they create, but then these systems will then go back and check that it is consistent with whatever fact base you are feeding to the underlying LLM. So at Google, our Gemini models are now grounded on Google Search. Our cloud customers can use their own enterprise data to ground the models they use. And that is like significantly improving the reliability and factuality of these models. On the much bigger question of what is big tech's responsibility, I think the corollary of like how transformational this technology is going to be is that there is a very big responsibility for the companies that are involved in its development. At Google, we have this mantra of bold, responsible, and together. We want to be bold in the sense of applying this technology to kind of take on society's biggest challenges and also improve people's daily lives. We want to be responsible in that everything we do with AI is aligned with the principles, the AI principles we published in 2018. I won't go over all of them, but the first one is that the applications are socially beneficial, and I think everything kind of stems from that. And to Christine's point, in a slightly different direction, principles aren't enough. One of the things we do is we publish a progress report annually to make sure we're accountable to maintaining those principles. And then finally, on together, I think this conversation, and particularly the list that Christine said of all the things that could go wrong with the technology, it drives home the point that there are a lot of stakeholders that should be around the table in discussions on how we use this technology, how we translate technological breakthroughs into widespread economic benefit. And so we are committed to doing that in partnership with government, with academia, with civil society. And then finally, I would say we've always said that this technology is too important not to be regulated and too important not to be regulated well. So to Christine's point, there's lots of different approaches that are being thought through now, and I think we're actually really encouraged by the thought that's been given to make sure we are using the technology, but not stifling, very innovative paths that can really benefit all of us.
Ira, what are some of the financial stability risks that emanate from AI? What are the biggest pockets of vulnerability when it comes to the financial system?
So, like in all things AI, there's opportunities and risks. So, when we think about opportunities, like other business operations, AI has the potential to deliver significant productivity gains for financial systems. And we're already beginning to see some of these sort of materialize. So for instance, AI could improve risk forecasting for risk management purposes. It could enhance credit scoring or fraud detection. So all of these things are pluses, if you will. But at the same time, it does create risks. And these have been highlighted in a series of papers that the IMF has published, but also other players are increasingly focusing on, what are some of the systemic financial system stability risks that could be generated. Now, some of these risks are not unique to financial systems. We've talked already about, privacy concerns. We've talked about cyber threats. We've talked about embedded bias, hallucination. All of these things we've talked about. But there's certain areas which sort of give us some pause for concern. And they involve the outcome for the potential for creating new sources and transmission channels for financial stability risks. For instance, AI algorithms could employ sentiment analysis and social media signals as inputs, and this could potentially amplify procyclicality and herding behavior in financial markets. The kind of models that are used for forecasting and the lack of model transparency could itself challenge the effectiveness of, say, emergency financial sectors measures that are put in place to alleviate systemic stress. Other concerns involve the use of AI to summarize data or to use AI for decision making in the first place. So financial regulators, will really need to upskill. They will need to be able to identify and mitigate AI-regulated risks, including contingency planning to prevent and respond to cyber threats, and also to think about, there's a big unknown here. What are the guardrails that need to be put in place? I mean, these are big questions. If we don't know what could potentially happen, we have to, in a sense, ex ante, think about what guardrails do countries and financial systems need to put in place to minimize vulnerabilities in the first place. So I think there is, we've talked about regulation. There are two questions. One is, does it have to be ex ante or does it have to be ex post? Well, ex ante means that we really know about all states of nature, and ex post, it could be too late. So there's also a fine balancing act between too little, too late, too early, stifle innovation. I think that's a fundamental question in this debate as well.
Christine, you brought up the notion of regulatory arbitrage, an unlevel playing field. Do we need a global set of rules when it comes to AI? Maybe something along the lines of Basel, like what we saw for the international banking system following the 2008 global financial crisis.
Yeah, I think as I alluded to earlier, there are a few international initiatives I thought were useful. One of them is the Rome Call on AI Ethics. So that's kind of setting a bit the common values. Another one is the UNESCO's recommendation also on ethics of AI. But recently also there is this Bletchley Declaration. I think UK organized the discussion and 20-something countries already signed up. I think in that context, I mention it because both US and China signed up. So I think that's an encouraging sign that hopefully, at least there is a consensus that we all need to work on this together. And we may not agree on everything, but having the converging views, right, is very important to avoid the regulatory divergence and then the regulatory arbitrage. And in addition to that, of course, there's a UN high-level advisory body on AI, which we sit on. So we'll continue, this dialogue through UN agencies. But in practice, we'll continue also to look at regional opportunities through our projects to be more practical on the implementation and technical assistance and advisory side to bring it hopefully to the practice. But I agree with all the panelists, right? And there's just so many stakeholders that we need to bring together. And it's a daunting task, and we need to work together.
We've covered so much ground this afternoon, risks, promises, pros and cons. What's the one message you want to leave with the audience today? Ira, let me start with you, and then we can just go on down the line.
Okay, so I'm going to start with an African saying that says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. So we need multilateral cooperation on AI because AI knows no borders. So I think that's an important message. But at the same time, societies will need to really carefully think about how is it that we can really harness the potential gains from AI for all.
Christine?
So actually this morning I asked ChatGPT what I should say. So I got a few jokes and picked one. So let me share with you. So AI is like a digital Swiss Army knife. It slices through data, it dices up problems, and sometimes it opens a can of worms. And whether it's driving cars or writing poetry, AI is really getting just started on its ride through our century. So we better, buckle our seatbelt, get ready, understand it, and manage it.
I think the message I've been trying to convey is one of optimism and urgency. Optimism, because I think there is a credible path towards broader diffusion and faster diffusion of this technology than many might expect. And urgency, because that is not at all inevitable, and it's going to take real action, political commitment, resource mobilization, and collaboration, as we've mentioned.
Chris?
So I think for me, the message that I'd like to leave with you is let's really invest. We need massive resources and partnerships, in Africa's innovation ecosystem. I think we cannot just be happy with reaping the incremental benefits of AI, but we really want to harness the economic opportunities, so we can empower our communities and truly have shared prosperity.
Well, AI certainly just getting started. So many questions, so much that we could have talked about. You covered so much ground even just in this 1 hour. Thank you so much for this excellent discussion, all four of you. So appreciate it. And thank you all so much. That concludes our panel.